Notice how the pawn structure that I have is very specifically designed to cover all the squares that black's knights may want to move to. Now there's no knight move there. And you go here, you've got nothing. Your pawns cover the other two squares. You go here, you go here, you go here, you've got nothing. You go here, you've got nothing. You go here, you go here. Well, that square is covered. And G6 is covered. And D7 is covered. You see how rough that knight is on E8? I'm going to start the game with D4. Let me know what opening you guys want to see here. Depends what he plays. D6. Okay. What do we think? London, Jobava London, and I don't think it's a very good time to play bishop f4 here. Doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm just gonna play e4. Look, I mean, if someone's playing d6, why would I not take the center? Okay, so e5, there are lots of ways we could play. I'm just gonna play in the most obvious way. I mean, plain and simple, this is not what black wants to do. I mean, I know it's, I know the queens are off the board, so there might not be checkmating threats anymore, but it's important after you take to still play accurately here. I think the most accurate move is definitely bishop c4, hitting that pawn. That's precisely what the king is not protecting anymore. So sort of hitting him where he's weak, where he's tender. He's got to defend it. Bishop e6 is playable as he's doing, but very insufficient, right? These doubled pawns are not nice to look at. Okay, let's develop our pieces. I do want a long castle because that's gonna gain time. But how am I gonna develop from here? Probably this knight to d2. Maybe the knight gets to c4. I don't really love a knight on c3. Why? What's it doing there? Like, those squares are not very appealing. e4 is taken. So I'm definitely more of a knight d2 kind of person rather than a knight c3 guy. Same thing for him, by the way. I would also put his knight on d7. So I'm going to play knight to d2. If he goes knight here, yeah, he's kind of threatening knight g4. He's also maybe threatening that pawn. So I want to have f3 ready to play against that. So my structure is going to look something like pawn on f3, all protected, nice and solid for me. Castles, pawn to c3 to stop the knight and the bishop from accessing any of those squares. And then this knight I'd love to put on maybe the c4 square where it hits that pawn. And this knight is, you know, up to me to put somewhere, either h3, f2, knight e2 to c3. It's got to find a nice home. Oh, we have time. That can be one of the last pieces that we develop. Okay, he's gone king back over. I'm going to play c3. Seems very useful to take some squares. I'm going to long castle, which was kind of the whole point of... doing all this was to castle. e6. Again, he's not playing bad moves. Not at all. He's got the queens off the board, so he's got a very good position. I'm gonna play f3, get our structure that we want. But probably my position is gonna look something like a4, knight c4, knight to d3, king to c2, maybe trade a pair of rooks. So right now I already have the next 10 plus moves mapped out. I do. a4 is a nice one. My pawns generally want to find themselves on light squares. So a4, a5, his pawns end up fixed on dark squares. Mine end up on light squares, and the only bishops on the board are dark square bishops, so that benefits me. He's taking his time. I definitely like to see that. Good sign in general. So one thing I don't really want to do is I don't want to move this knight before I connect my rooks. Because if he takes me, I want to be able to take with my rook. Okay, bishop here. It's a no-brainer that we're going to capture this. Now he's got 2 sets of doubled and isolated pawns. So I'm taking that immediately. Now I've still got to finish development. This knight needs a way in. I am not a fan of knight e2. Where am I going? I just don't understand. Knight h3, I might be going to d3, which is one of the best squares on the board for a knight, actually. So knight h3 is way, way better than knight e2. And I think almost everyone would play knight e2, just because it's the central move. So I'm not interested in winning anything outright here. I'm interested in showing you guys my setup. It's going to be knight h3, knight f2. I don't need to go win these pawns right away. These pawns are dead in the water. I'm going to win something in the future here. Knight d3, knight c4, maybe knight b3, but it depends on what he does. So knight h3, knight f2, and the reason I'm kind of doing all this is this was the exact way that I was going to play, you know, ages ago. These were all the moves that I was talking about. Black's position is not really going to improve. Good move, and I'm hoping that he has in mind this move, because that's a good defensive move. But yeah, king c2 doesn't seem like super relevant, but it also guards d3, helps me play knight d3, and gets my king perhaps geared up for an endgame. All right, I like g5 as a move. Gaining some space. Doing the right things. I think it's time to move one of these knights. Now that my rook can take back, I am kind of partial to the move knight c4. I'm going to do that one. Looking to create, in his position, as many weaknesses as possible. h4 looks like a nice move too. If we take, for example, obviously if the rook's defended, then the g pawn will be weakness, the e pawns are weakness, the c pawns are weak. Every single pawn in his position will be weak after something like that, right? So that's why I'm so preoccupied with something like h4. So I think I am going to do h4. Having a think here, he could potentially play g4, which I don't love, but yeah, we can just play knight takes, and we have knight e3 at the end. So I will go h4. One thing we could do is we could take first and then do it, because the d file is not extremely relevant for me. I kind of like that. Notice how this c pawn is just a total hero here, stopping the knight. Yes, we could play knight d3, but he's also going to play knight d7. Like, he might not, obviously he could blunder, but he should be ready to play knight d7. So instead I'm just going here. I've got knight d3 in my pocket anytime I want to play it, and he's going to have to play knight d7 to cover his weaknesses. But his pieces are going to be tied down for the rest of the game. That's just the reality of his position here. Trying to create as many weaknesses as possible. Look, I like the move. There's a reason why I was mentioning this move as a possibility. I don't know if he saw everything that I was looking at, but I think this is good for me because I have knight e3, but it was the first thing I considered. He doesn't allow the h-file to get open. Yes, he loses a pawn, but after rook there, you're almost winning it right back. It's just I have knight e3, and I think my position should be good after that. So I'm taking with the knight in order to get rid of this guy. I think that's one of black's best pieces. This knight is awful, really bad piece on c6, so I'm just leaving it there. Also, knight takes any pawn here is about to be pretty good for me. So I think he's got to take my knight. This 400 seems pretty good. I agree with you. There's one concept though that I want to remind you of, and it's the important concept that the type of game that you play against someone will always dictate your impression of how strong they are. For example, in this game, my opponent played d6 e5. It's a really not a good opening. And it's not a good opening because of what I did. I play queen takes d8, black is just slightly worse. But if I really wanted to maybe test him a little bit more, I might not take and trade the queens on move 3. Right? I might instead keep the queens on the board and just move my knight out or something. And it's quite possible that if I did that he might blunder within the next 5 moves. Maybe lose the game extremely quickly. My opponent has actually committed a lot of mistakes in this game, but they're not the type of mistakes that you see checkmates from. They're much smaller mistakes. And we've seen doubled pawns here. We see doubled isolated pawns here. So a really terrible pawn structure. You know, this move did hang a pawn, and then this move also hangs another pawn. So I actually agree. I think he's playing tremendously well. But I also always remember that even myself, if it's like a very positional game like this, it can feel boa constricting. Wow, Amon is so good. But then if you put me in like a tactical position, tactical melee, all of a sudden it might not look as good. So everyone just has their strengths, and usually lower rated players, the more pieces that are on the board, the more tactics, the more they're likely to blunder. So I definitely do not think that this game has been very testing at all in that department. So even though my opponent's definitely making some mistakes, they're comparatively not as bad. So we took on e5 here. That was a free pawn. My opponent did guard the h-pawn. Probably should have traded knights there. But still, I love how much time my opponent's spending. Definitely really considering options every single move, which is exactly what you should do. But even though it's not entirely clear, or it might not seem that way, notice how the pawn structure that I have is very specifically designed to cover all the squares that black's knights may want to move to. So it might not look like much, but the pawns are where they are for a reason. Black's knights don't have many options here. Knight d7, rook d1 would pin the knight and end the game almost immediately. The pawns are all weaknesses at the moment. Okay, h5. How are we going to continue now? I do want to get my rook involved. It really hasn't been doing anything. I kind of like this, I'm not going to lie. I kind of like rook h3 to g3 because it seems like I'll get right in there. And how useful is his rook on this file? Notice how every single square is covered. That's why I didn't mind trading and giving him the d file. It's counterintuitive, but my rook is actually more useful than his. This is a completely nothing file for him. However, the sad part for him is that if he gives it up, I'll take it, and it is actually useful for me. I can play knight d7 maybe, and then control it. So he's in a tough spot where I don't need the D file, you can have it, but if you don't have it, then I'll take it and it will be very useful. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that an open file is valuable. It's only valuable if it's useful. And right now, the rook has absolutely no anchor square. He can't move to any of these squares. So yeah, the D file is useless for him. So my next idea is rook g3, very clearly. Black's king is in trouble because let's say I check and the king goes here. There's knight f7 fork, there's rook g6 fork. If I check and the king goes here, my rook can still go to g6. Hit the knight, there's that pawn behind it. And again, notice how my pawns are dominating this knight. No knight g4, no knight d5, no knight e4. The pawns are covering everything. And now there's no knight h5. So this knight doesn't really have a lot of squares. There's pretty much nothing to do. Wouldn't surprise me if he maybe considered a move like this. As for me, I haven't been too interested in playing knight c6, even though it would be a good move, just because the rooks are on the board, and even if I take this, maybe he'll get some counterplay. I just don't really believe that my opponent has that much to do in the current position, so I'm kind of taking advantage of that. So I think what we're gonna see here is a rook trade, and then you'll notice that these weak pawns are just so easy for me to capture. And meanwhile, the knight, as we've been talking about, has no entry squares, and that's the plan. That's the simple plan there. We'll see where he puts the king, but almost no matter where he puts the king, I'm trading the rooks. Even king h8, knight f7, king here, knight g5, it's still not very good. Goes king there, very reasonable move. I am gonna trade. Okay, and now, like I said, just bring that king. This knight is really struggling for a square here. So it's like, you look at the way my opponent's played, and it's really just that the positional deficiencies are so crippling that even though he's finding, in my opinion, not only good moves, but good moves for his level, it's not enough. You could play the best moves as black, you know, since 10 moves ago and still be in a much worse position. King takes. And yeah, I'm just looking at this knight and I'm actually wondering to myself, what is this knight gonna do? It cannot move anywhere. All off limits. These are the only squares available, and they all look very sad. This square, no prospects. This square to go here, no prospects. This square to go here, no prospects. This square is blocked. This square and this square is like the only option that actually leads somewhere. And even still, where is he going after d6? Knight f7? Well, it's covered by my knight. Knight f5, covered. Knight c4 covered. Knight b5, only square available. And you know what I would do if this ever happened? I would play a4 because I'm mean. I'm not nice. King c6. The knight has nothing to do. There are no available squares for the knight. There's no rerouting. It's unpleasant. Okay, so he's played this move. It guards the pawn, so it's a good move for multiple reasons. But knight d6 may have the idea to go here, maybe here. And even still, if I want to go win this pawn, yeah, you know, that's absolutely a plan, but I'm gonna need to push my pawn anyway. So I'm probably gonna start with a pawn push here. I like that this covers the b5 square as we were just talking about, but as I said, I'm gonna need to push it towards the a8, so this is just a good starting move. king d8. Again, another good move. He's covering the pawn. Now he's saying, okay, my knight is free to finally move. d6 looks like the destination. But again, the problem is after knight d6, there's not really, there are no squares for him past that. Let's play c4. Now I'm looking to play c5. Again, many other ways to win, like king here takes. I 100% agree. The method that I'm choosing here is the most sadistic. The method that I'm choosing will not allow this knight to participate in the chess game that's ongoing. It's gonna have to sit on the bench and be a bench warmer. That's it. a5. Okay, so I could go take that pawn right here, but again, it definitely seems to me like the move c5 is the most unpleasant. Now there's no knight move there, and you go here, you've got nothing. Your pawns cover the other two squares. You go here, you go here, you go here, you've got nothing. You go here, you've got nothing. You go here, you go here, well, that square is covered. And g6 is covered, and d7 is covered. You see how rough that knight is on e8? It's all from the placement of the pawns. Again, another fantastic move. He's playing so well. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. He's playing extremely well. It's just an unpleasant position. Like, it's not fun. Just truth. All right, time to go collect. I think this has absolutely been one of the best showings we've seen. I expect probably that move. But I don't imagine that this knight is going to be much of a participant in the game. So if I take here, which is my plan, then after knight there, he may want to play knight there. So I think our plan would be to take here, and after that play king b6 to absolutely not allow knight a6. We can't allow the knight out. Remember, those two squares are covered by the pawns. e6 is his own pawn. So we're gonna make sure to play king b6 so we don't allow knight a6. The knight will not see the light of day. Going after this pawn, but also ensuring that we don't allow knight a6. And if I ever move my knight here, I'm not saying it's a mistake, but if I ever move my knight, the pawn will push. Maybe he won't do it, but it's possible he pushes the pawn. And then his knight gets this square and this square and it jumps around. Of course I'm completely winning there, but it kind of negates my whole thing here and my whole purpose. Again, another very good move, truly. King there, and I mean, if we do something like this, then I'm thinking king b7, and I don't think the knight gets out there, but he certainly may try to move it, and that might be our best option. But just evaluating things here, I can push this pawn forward, but then after knight there, the knight starts to escape. So we can't really push this pawn for any reason. Like it doesn't really make sense. I'm gonna play the move b3. We'll call it a waiting move. And I also don't want to move any pawns here because who knows? Maybe the knight's gonna start dreaming of a way out. We can't have that. I'm just going to play pawn here. Now, if the knight moves now, we can take. He goes back. Again, a pretty good move in my opinion. Pretty good move. I'm now considering to take the pawn and just go b4. Atticus has truly at every moment demonstrated that he's up to task. Like, he's covered everything. This has been a really good game that he will get credit for, by the way, in the game review. I can promise you right now, when we go to the game review, you will see him credited. Like, he's not going to have like a 20% game review. He is absolutely going to be killing it in the final analysis. So I'm not concerned for Atticus. Now, what I'm curious about is after I go here, how he's going to respond. Because the knight can move or the king can move. There's truly only two moves on the board. Now, instead of taking this pawn, I'm going to move my king again. So now by moving my king, his knight doesn't have any squares except one. And his king doesn't have any squares except those two, which would lose the knight. So he's now required to play this move. And now when I go take the pawn, his king won't be able to come to b7. So this way, not only does he not get to experience any knight activity, but he doesn't even get to touch the a6 square. He doesn't even get to sniff what freedom would feel like. Now we play king b6 and we go take this pawn. We could have taken this pawn with the pieces back here, but we're taking it in a much better way now. We've minimized counterplay to an absolute 0. The knight returns, of course. We'll take that pawn. And with the king not on that square, now it means that our pawns can start moving forward as well. King goes back. Would love to play here. Of course, I'm leaving this pawn here, so importantly, to cover knight d6. That way, that's, you know, it's never an idea. Now we'll bring our king back to b6, and it's time for these pawns to start pushing up. Check. I can go this way, but I believe going here is a little more forcing. Okay, the knight has to return, of course. We'll make sure not to push this pawn and give him the b5 square, but rather the b pawn. Now, there remain no squares available. And remember, if he, switches back to this side of the board, he's still not escaping at all. Let's once again force the knight to go here because he's been in this position before and there are no knight moves available. No king moves available. He must bring the knight back. Okay, that square is covered. Now we're gonna play b5, and when the knight goes back, we'll play b6, and once again, all these squares will be covered, including that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and then that's blocked by your own pawn. Notice how I haven't moved my knight, and how many moves has it been? Now we'll push the a pawn. Now that he doesn't even have that square, he's gonna have to yield more ground with his king as well. We're starting to push him back from every direction, making a point against that knight, directly against that knight. Now, instead of going to promote a pawn, I'm probably going to use my king a little bit here. Just do something like this. Let's play king c6 now, keeping these squares covered, of course. Okay, he goes back with the king. Perhaps a little surprising. Let's now push one of these pawns. The king's going back this way. And I think at this point, the move a7 is more than sufficient. The knight can't go anywhere. The king can't even encroach on the pawn. And the knight on e8 still doesn't really have anywhere productive to go. King back to d8, of course. Definitely a very good move. I think at this point, move like g3. If my opponent wants to go back, they'll walk into a nice checkmate. But of course, I expected that would not be the case. We see king to e7. Okay. Now we're gonna make a promotion. And what I've been wondering is why my opponent was not keen on playing this move. King to f6 to attack my knight. And I'm honestly kind of waiting for it. I'm not really sure why it isn't happening. So I'm gonna play here. I'm quite sure that this will be the move. I'm gonna push my other pawn. We'll see what happens. But I have to expect king f6 at some point. It does seem to be the most freeing type of move. Yeah, there we go. That makes a little more sense. So now our knight can finally move for the first time in the game. The king goes back, and now I'm going to play e5. Now e5 is going to lock the knight in rather permanently. And even though it looks like we let the knight escape, we now play the move g4. And after g4, we ensure there's definitely no way that the knight gets out. Now we've really done it. King to d8 probably. We can just kind of like force the knight into a corner. It's actually the truth that, you know, of course, a knight on the corner is one of the worst squares you can ever have a knight on the board. But the second worst square you can ever have a knight is actually one of these four squares. Have you ever heard someone say a fianchettoed knight? They're often, well, every time you hear that, they're probably being ironic. No one ever wants a fianchettoed knight. And it's been a long road, but I believe that we have finally trapped the knight. The knight doesn't have anywhere else to move. We've really done this with just the pawns and the king. Our knight moved towards the very end, but that was pretty much it. The knight that now doesn't have anywhere to move, so it'll probably just have to be the king. Right? At some point, you're going to have to give up the knight. But, you know, the point of this game was to demonstrate that we can actually stalemate the black king. Now, black is going to be forced to give up the knight, but I'm not even going to take it. I'm going to be checkmating my opponent with my pawn, my knight, and my king, just like we intended from the very beginning. I don't even want the knight. You know, the moment I was finally able to take it, I didn't even want it. I hope everyone learned something from that. And I do mean that seriously. No, I don't hope that we all took immense pleasure in watching me clown a 400. Because guess what? Let's look at the game review. You guys think he got clowned? Have a look at his accuracy. 84.7. Did I not say that he was going to get his revenge in the game review? He played a good game. That's just the facts. I mean, that's just it. We knew it. He was playing a good game. But there are some things like tactics. They're flashy, you know, they're nice to look at. Tactics are, you know, one way to punish someone's mistakes, but there's a whole other way to play chess, which is a little bit more positionally. And this entire game, I was basically trying to play in a way that would minimize counterplay. Keeping track of the knight is a tough thing to do. Of course I overkilled it, because I think it was rather a picturesque checkmate, if I do say so myself. But the point is to think where the knight is going to move, and that's really what you do in knight endgames. You're not thinking one move ahead. Knight endgames, you really have to think, where can the knight move to, and where would it be threatening to move to from there? And against every possible reroute, in this case, you know, it wouldn't matter where they went. They would never have a way to actually invade the position. And we sort of kept the knight, you know, completely wrapped up to the point where we got it on one of the worst squares. And this is a, you know, particularly illustrative. The knight on this square, such a bad piece. It's so easy to corral. For example, if you just had a rook on e5, do you see how you'd be trapping that knight? If you had a rook on e5, knight can't move anywhere. Right? If you have a bishop on d7, you're taking away just about every square the knight has, except one. And okay, maybe you have a pawn or a king somewhere, or maybe they have a pawn there, and the knight's trapped. And we see in this case, the pawn does a tremendous job, black's pawn's in the way. There are just many, many ways to sort of trap a knight on that square. In chess, if you see a position where black has fianchettoed pawns, and then they have a knight there, you'll often see white playing g4, because why not? Take the two squares from the knight. The knight's so bad on that square. So this was more to just illustrate that, you know, the knight on that square is in a pretty bad spot. My opponent played right till the very end, and it doesn't matter where you put the knight now. The point is that this king is now mated by my remaining pieces, and not only did he play a fantastic game, I mean, look at the game review, 85%. He played a great game, but he did commit some mistakes that just aren't as flashy looking or aren't as flashy to punish as tactics. A lot of positional mistakes. Now, that's much better than hanging pieces, trust me. So I don't recommend blundering pieces instead of the mistakes he made, but I'm just saying they exist as well. And there's a whole other side of chess, positional side, where mistakes were made this game. But he played really well. At 400, I want this guy in my sub-battle team, that's for sure.